Chairman. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and congratulations on your 100 years of the service. This is an important landmark. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here today. I had my first ever teaching job at the University of Amsterdam, so consequently I'm very pleased to be back and have very fond memories of the Netherlands, which I'm really enjoying. I have to say before I start that everything that I say is my own words. I do not represent the United States government or the United States military in my presentation today. In the early 1990s, strategic intelligence programs are paying increasing attention towards rogue states and, to a lesser extent, the emergent Al-Qaeda. Nevertheless, in 2001, the vast US intelligence enterprise was still configured for conventional challenges. Strategic or national intelligence assets were largely dedicated to assessing the postures and, ideally, the intentions of global nuclear forces. Military intelligence assets busied themselves with myriad technical challenges of assessing the strengths, dispositions, and capabilities of the armed forces of rogue states and rogue and competitor states. When Bin Laden escaped Tora Bora in December 2001, the stage was set for a long campaign against a new target set. It took time to build an intelligence system aligned to the novel challenges of finding individuals within a shadowy global network. When General McChrystal took over as command in Afghanistan, and this goes somewhat to the question about the two views of whether the fusion centers work or not. It depends at what level. And the level I'll be particularly focusing on today is special forces. So when McChrystal took over, he continued the rhetoric of COIN, counterinsurgency, which was a manual that was propagated and was particularly popular in Iraq. We don't hear about it so much anymore. You might want to ask yourselves why. But behind the scenes, the US dramatically escalated the counter-terrorism effort via a unique combination of special operations forces enabled by national intelligence assets. This adaptation has proved so effective that it became the basis of a new kind of strategy for taking the fight to Al-Qaeda around the world. The Abbottabad raid was, without any exaggeration, the culmination of a decade of fundamental change in the character of and interrelationships between US intelligence, military forces, and grand strategy. Strategic intelligence assets have been turned to answer the most tactical questions imaginable, right down to the location and activities of specific individuals. Strategic intelligence programs have been consumed by how individuals connect through social, electronic, and financial networks, both in combat zones and far away from them. Equally, military intelligence programs have struggled to adapt to the non-technical challenges of understanding culture, religion, ethnicity, and social structures in profoundly foreign, non-Western operational environments. Taken together, these are the most radical reconfigurations of the business of intelligence since the dawn of the nuclear age, in my view. Intelligence is about understanding context and ultimately enabling change. It used to be the case that strategic intelligence provided contextual understanding and ideally warning, although rarely. I just say ideally. While military intelligence provided the commander with a pathway through which violent change could be effectively implemented. Today, these relationships are reversed. Military intelligence is being asked to provide cultural context, and strategic intelligence is lining up targets to be hit. The degree of adaptation of the US intelligence system in such a short period of time is pretty remarkable. The adaptation has a correlate to how military forces used against the new enemy. Special operations forces are tightly integrated into the network of strategic intelligence assets, in many cases to the exclusion of all other forces, which goes to the point about general purpose forces, fusion centers versus special operations forces and national strategic intelligence assets working side by side, hand in glove. In a very real sense, special operations forces, which from now on I'll call SOF, and strategic intelligence have combined to become a distinct arm of the US military. This is, again, my view. How SOF and strategic intelligence are used, how that connects to the new intelligence paradigm with significantly enhanced human intelligence capabilities compared to a decade ago, and how both new trends connect to US grand strategy against Al-Qaeda and its organizations similar to it, is a subject of my paper today. There were essentially three wars in Afghanistan. We had the first pushing out of the Taliban, quick regime change, then we had an economy of force mission And then we had the realization that, a decision that we should try and build a nation. I think that last mission was a very problematic one that the military should not be involved in. Partly because Afghanistan, as we think of a nation state, does not exist. It's not even an imagined community. It's a set of arbitrary lines over a largely impenetrable terrain that bound multiple competing nations or ethnic, tribal, and sub-clan identities that have fought each other, and especially outsiders, for millennia. The nations inside the territory survive in a pre-modern tribal environment governed by traditional law, imposing Western ideas, institutions, and systems of economics and governance from outside on a deeply complicated and largely divided social landscape was and remains a fool's errand. This leaves the most recent war, when all else fails, kill the enemy. There are 4 key obstacles to progress in Afghanistan. First is the enduring impact of dependence on the Janus-based frenemy of Pakistan, the weakness, corruption, and cultural incongruity of centralized government, the intractable narco-economy and the lack of viability of legal alternatives, and the lack of capacity of the Afghan military to conduct independent security operations. The central government will last as long as Allied forces are on the ground, is my assessment, which makes the situation very problematic. And with respect to the economy, with 97% of Afghan GDP reported dependent on foreign aid, economic reconstruction, keeping coin, has failed. Equally, so long as Pakistan fears India more than it fears Islamist terrorists, it will be more than an enemy than a friend in Afghanistan, a reality that has been in stark relief since the Abbottabad raid, where we got bin Laden. Clearly then, the success of the bin Laden raid points to a vital lesson for the US strategic community, namely that a small footprint counter-terrorist strategy against an enemy network, made possible through the combination of strategic intelligence and SOF, is analytically challenging, but probably the most effective approach to the unique problem set that these enemies present. The cost-effectiveness of such a strategy is hugely important in a resource-constrained environment, but even that benefit is secondary to the more complex challenge of deterring, denying, and killing the loose global network of individuals, without having to take on a series of nation-building challenges wherever individual members of this network are found. Not only can the US not afford such a challenge, but the evidence is fairly conclusive that social change from within is far superior to change imposed by foreign force from without. I'll talk a little bit about some of the reforms that I mentioned actually earlier, the 2004 reforms, and how that's essentially created yet another layer of bureaucracy, the ODNI. The problem is the ODNI doesn't have control of the budget. So if you don't have control of the budget in Washington, you don't have anything. In Washington, if you want to know what's really happening, you have to follow the money. It is therefore notable that at a time when the Department of Defense is set to enter a period of significant budgetary decline, intelligence and special forces together are enjoying spectacular growth, and that is set to continue. The combined national and military intelligence budgets have more than trebled since 2001, from approximately 26 billion to 80 billion in 2010. The new intelligence spending has generated an incredible expansion of strategic intelligence capability since 2001. By one simplistic measure, more than 17 million square feet of office space for top secret intelligence work is under construction and has been built since 2001. That's the equivalent of 4.5 Pentagons. Just think about that. And that's skiff space. That is behind the door, behind the door, behind the door. And there's obviously a lot of other office space that exists around to service those many doors. More than 850,000 people have top secret security clearances. It is estimated that 31% of these are contractors, and 206 new classified organizations have been created, giving a total of 1,200 government organizations and 1,900 private companies working on programs related to counterterrorism, homeland security, and intelligence in about 10,000 locations across the United States. Moreover, the Defense Intelligence Agency personnel numbers have swelled from 7,500 in 2002 to 16,500 in 2010. It's probably more than that by now. That doesn't include contractor support that is likely to be as much as 4 times that number. The list of code word names for specific highly classified special access programs, or SAPs, is in excess of 300 pages of close type-spaced script. As James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, put it, and I quote, "There is only one entity in the entire universe that has all visibility on all SAPs. That is God." The United States, as you're probably aware, has a particular fascination and focus and attention on technical intelligence issues or capabilities. And the scale of the challenge is particularly interesting. We heard in the last talk, for example, about big data. Well, this is big data on steroids. The scale of challenges the strategic intelligence enterprise faces on a daily basis is staggering, and I quote from a study. "Terabytes of foreign intelligence information come in each day, vastly exceeding the entire text holdings of the Library of Congress, which is estimated to be 10 terabytes. The National Counterterrorism Center's 24-hour operations center receives 8,000 to 10,000 pieces of counterterrorism information, roughly 10,000 names plus 40 specific threats and plots every single day." So you need a technological base to see that. There are other examples I cited in the paper, the real-time regional gateway and various other databases that exist downrange. The then Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell, in briefing the President when President Obama came to office, said, "They talk, we listen, they move, we observe. Given the opportunity, we react operationally." Talk about other nanosatellites, ground-based sensors, etc., etc. We can go into that in Q&A perhaps. There's a lot of criticism, of course, of the scale of what we're talking about and therefore the waste. But redundancy is useful in intelligence work, but there's little doubt that the system is too large to effectively be controlled. Lieutenant General John R. Vines, retired, charged with reviewing methods for tracking sensitive DoD programs, was pretty shocked, and I quote, "I'm not aware of any agency with the authority, responsibility, or a process in which to concentrate all of these agency and commercial activities. The complexity of the system defies description. Because it lacks a synchronizing process, it inevitably results in message dissonance, reduced effectiveness, and waste. We consequently can't effectively assess what is making us more safe." It's pretty scary. The massive increase in funding is evidence of a very low base. The former chairman of the House of Representatives Intelligence Committee said, "We let human intelligence die on the vine during the Cold War," and that's very true. Since then, that has dramatically changed, and I'll give you some numbers on that as well. The soft budget mirrors that of the intelligence community. From 2001 to 2017, US Special Operations Command budget is on track to treble in size. It currently stands at 10.5 billion. It's actually a bit more than that already. One of the commanders is quoted as saying, "The force of 67,000 people has nearly doubled, the budget has nearly tripled, and overseas deployments have quadrupled." So it's been a pretty busy time. Referring to the human intelligence question, which is something that has been we've been behind the curve on that. After a long hiatus, human intelligence was returned to a position of the highest importance in the strategic intelligence and soft arsenal. Combining strategic intelligence and human with armed drones able to reach deep into Pakistan has paid handsome dividends in the war and points the way to an affordable and enduring global strategy against Al-Qaeda and its allies. The terrorist threat is inherently a human challenge. The literature is clear that human intelligence has long been a weakness of US capability. The then acting director of CIA, John McLaughlin, said in testimony, "I would say that we were in chapter 11, in other words, we were bankrupt in human intelligence during the 1990s. In 2000, just to give you an idea, in 2004, the CIA only had as many field agents as the FBI had agents in Manhattan. In testifying to the 9/11 Commission the same year, CIA Director George Tenet predicted that the CIA would not be able to field a sufficiently robust intelligence network against Al-Qaeda until 2009. Tenet was proved to be remarkably accurate in that assessment because Bin Laden raid happened after that, with a significant amount connected to the human intelligence program. Not only, but that was a key part of it. Significant improvements have been made in US human in recent years in Afghanistan and across the Fata. For a long time, the US relied on the Pakistan ISI to facilitate relationships on both sides of the border. You can see how I'm saying this is all my work, I'm not representing the government. But as evidence grew of Pakistani duplicity, the US undertook a series of major new efforts to build its own human network and to penetrate terrorist networks both inside and outside Afghanistan, and importantly in Pakistan itself. It got to the point where a Taliban, there was a quote in a newspaper article, and says, and I quote, "A Taliban commander in North Waziristan said that the militant group is trying to unmask the spies that have been guiding the airstrikes." So they're feeling the pressure. It was also true that when they accessed some of the sensitive site exploitation information at the Abbottabad site, the chief intelligence guy of Al-Qaeda had been reporting to bin Laden that both the scale of the US intelligence operations and connecting them to the incredibly high tempo night raids, some of which you're talking about 5 or 6 raids a night, this was something that was slowly built up, it just didn't come out of nowhere, really put enormous pressure on Al-Qaeda. Angered by the growing effectiveness of US human, Al-Qaeda created a counterintelligence unit. Documents found at the house in Pakistan show that this unit was badly compromised by US spies, leading the unit commander to tell bin Laden that Al-Qaeda was losing the human war. In terms of the scale of the raids, Admiral McCraven, the then operational commander of the Abbottabad raid, was reported as saying, quote, "Over the past 12 months, his unit task force conducted about 2,000 operations, roughly 88% of which were at night. That's about 5.5 a day." So what does all this mean? America cannot afford to undertake a vast global counterinsurgency nation-building effort in the foreseeable future everywhere an insurgent pops up. The US military should undoubtedly continue to build a culturally agile. The United States military should undoubtedly continue to become culturally agile, but it should not be turned into a global welfare organization whose initial response to a crisis is to dig a well or build a clinic in the hope that the local people will therefore choose not to shoot at them. When Obama came into office, during the 2009 review, Obama was quite clear on the new strategy to Afghanistan, where he said, quote, "I'm not doing long-term nation-building effort, I'm not spending $1 trillion, I'm not doing 10 years. So that kind of puts the pressure on what are you going to do next. Lawrence Braby once assessed that the Turks against whom he was organising in Arabia would need 600,000 men to meet the combined ill wills of all the local Arab people. They had 100,000 men available, unquote. According to the troop ratios recommended by the US military's own counterinsurgency manual, NATO should have 560,000 troops in Afghanistan back when we had the mission. 90 years to the day after the publication of The Evolution of a Revolt, NATO has 108,000. That sounds familiar. Without 600,000 troops for just Afghanistan, trillions of dollars and decades of time, and with a series of small wars in a number of locations outside of Afghanistan, against independent foes all requiring a US response, what is America to do? The great lesson of Lawrence imparts to strategists were not derived from the fact that he was a master of counterinsurgency. Rather, he was a master of the revolt. The only option that offers the US a long-term, cost-effective solution is turning the insurgents' methods against him, namely, adopting a comprehensive global counterterrorism strategy. Partnering with local enemies of our enemy, the US must enhance their capacity to resist extremism in their midst, and at the same time radically reduce its own footprint. The US must not make each war its own, but it must help those seeking to try and help themselves resist tyranny. And ultimately, by helping others in this way, the US will reduce safe havens from which attacks can be mounted against it. Critics of intelligence-driven, small-footprint counterterrorism approaches will say that this is just a recipe for an endless game of whack-a-mole. The enemy, too, has been following Mao's dictum, quote, "When the enemy advances, withdraw, when he stops, harass, when he tires, strike, and when he retreats, pursue," unquote. They are right, but without the time, funding, and forces required by the Coin Manual to properly implement a counter-insurgency strategy across the entire territory of Afghanistan, as the case study, counterinsurgency itself becomes a very expensive form of whack-a-mole. In order for the US to pass through the eye of the storm, it must move past its zero-defect approach to the war against Al-Qaeda and the like organizations. Despite the best intelligence system in the world, it is perhaps inevitable that a terrorist will again achieve a strike on the US homeland. That is the nature of this war, but is not to be a sign of weakness, as various domestic demagogues will invariably seek to paint such an attack once it happens. America has to be more resilient against its enemies, foreign and domestic. In conclusion, the counter-terrorist approach is cost-effective. It enables locals to implement and thus own the change they desire. It can be done subtly where America's footprint, moral or physical, does not provoke a sense of occupation, domination, or humiliation. Perhaps the US has finally worked out the right formula for defeating an enemy with networking conflict. Enable the locals to achieve their own political change. This is not a perfect system, or one without opportunities for significant setbacks. They will invariably come, but the long-term trends, coupled with smart application of hard power in the background, is in many ways preferable to invading and occupying alien cultures and insisting on changes we think are best for them. Thank you.
Thank you for giving an overview of something that not only by its secrecy but already by its sheer size seems to defy overview. You address the change in US strategy by having a light footprint, by helping others to help themselves, and you rightly indicated that this course will have its drawbacks as well. One of the main drawbacks seems to me that once you start helping people in the parts of the world where you think you have to do it because the type of war you're fighting, or terror, whatever you like to call it, is that in many of these parts of the world there is no good governance. And that by helping to help others, they may not, or your aid may not end up in the hands of your friends, but in the hands of your enemies. And this is true, of course, in Iraq and Syria, but it has been true in several parts of Africa. There are known cases for it. So how do you think that this part of your strategy should be addressed?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think we have to resist the temptation to go in everywhere. If you ask who is the moderator in a number of these places, who is the group we should support, that is an incredibly problematic question. And often who we support turns out not to be somebody you really want to go and have dinner with. So that is a really tough question. Sometimes it's best to stay out of it and let them resolve it themselves. But with the proviso that the kind of joint national intelligence special operations assets are available, and this is a very tough question in terms of basing and access, but are available to ensure that any of those groups that then want to hit outside of that territory that they're contesting will be visited by our friends. But aside from that, there's so much going on in some of these places. Being able to pick and choose, I think, is almost problematic. And if you have a look in Iraq, for example, right now, as a consequence of what I would argue was a mistaken war of choice against Iran, Iran was tremendously emboldened. But Iran has overstretched Iraq, and it is now in a pretty significant struggle with ISIS itself. The fact that Iran and ISIS are going against each other is quite ironic if you're familiar with Hezbollah, it does in Lebanon and other places of the world. So I'm okay with that kind of struggle taking place. That's kind of like an Iran-Iraq war in a totally different frame.
But what if you train troops in Kenya, provide them with arms, and actually the knowledge that you share with them ends up with the groups they are supposed to be fighting, and they sell their arms and so on?
Yes, it's not a perfect system. That does take place. And it's really up to intelligence to get the best sense of who you're working with, and to try and set limitations on the types of arms we're talking about, the scope of what they can do with them. But it's a very complicated world now, and people who change allegiances, both on the other side and on working with us. So it's not easy. This is not an easy war.
Questions? If not, I have another one. Sorry, there's one there? Okay, yeah.
I'm very interested in what you said about T. Lawrence and his relevance and stuff, but I may be a bit thick or a bit slow here. Are you saying that counterinsurgency is done by, say, UK and USA, and counterterrorism is done by sepoys or locals? Is that the difference?
No. What I was trying to what I discussed in the paper, it's available if anyone will look at it in more depth. But it was talking about the numbers of personnel required if you were to do a counterinsurgency mission versus a counterterrorism mission. The counterterrorism mission is, as I described it as we've been practicing it, is essentially a US operation, but in conjunction with locals. Am I answering the question?
Yes, but isn't counterinsurgency also in cooperation with locals?
Sure, I'm not saying it's not, but counterinsurgency is a huge footprint type operation where you're trying to support a state governing a territory, whereas counterterrorism is focused just specifically on enemy combatants and taking out the leadership and trying to break the network. So you're not trying to build a nation state, you're not trying to provide all these other services, you're just going after the enemy in a very particularly strict sort of military sense, if you like.
So not hearts and minds, but headshots.
Look, we can't go, we the West, we the United States can't go to every place in the world where there's some Islamist jihadis and change those societies, but that just provides part of the narrative of jihadist groups that we're trying to occupy Muslim lands and all this kind of thing. So this is not a winning strategy, and it's extreme cost, and we just don't have the personnel numbers to do it. So COIN might be nice if you had a couple of decades and 600,000 people to hold down Afghanistan, which is roughly the numbers that T. Lawrence was talking about for the Turks to try and suppress his folks. But we don't have that. We don't have that time. So the CT option is ugly. It's militaristic. It's a connection with drones, which are very unpopular. But I can assure you that a drone is going to be a much more discriminating weapon system against an individual target or a small group of people than sending in any kind of airstrike, any other kind of other airstrike, or a manned team of special operators, that kind of thing. So it is a highly discriminatory weapon. It's not perfect, but it's kind of the Western, the other side developed IEDs and we developed drones. It's kind of an IED drone war. So.
Yeah, and related to that, you mentioned in passing that we don't hear very much about counterinsurgency anymore. Why is that, do you think?
Quite honestly, my assessment is that it's fallen out of popularity in circles inside the Beltway. It's almost seen now as passé. Partly, I think, because of the reasons I outlined, in the sense of it hasn't worked. I think we see very strong evidence of that. So then, what's the alternative? And the alternative, it seems to my mind anyway, is the CT approach, as ugly and difficult as it is to accept.
Mark, I'm going to make a comment on that. Well, all of us are trying to understand the US position here. Well, you're absolutely right on the positive and critical side. What hasn't worked on the insurgency in Vietnam and all that. And on the ideological side, well, there was the neocon programming. We Democrats don't go with that. So you could have been away. But I would like to suggest there may be a deeper story here that goes back to what the US is imagining itself to be. And for some of us, that goes back to the initial TV series Star Wars. What was it in there? The prime directive. Don't go and get involved with all these primitive societies. You can't change them. Is that Obama's guiding principle? That you cannot change these primitive societies. Don't bother to go with them. And so there you go. You adopt the gunfight at OK Corral problem. Just go in there, shoot them up, and get out. Gunfight at OK Corral, famous 1957 Hollywood movie.
Far be it for me to say that the president takes his strategic guidance from the creators of Star Trek. But I think there's some substance to this question in the sense that in the tradition of American foreign policy going back to our founding fathers, both President George Washington and more recently, of course, President Dwight Eisenhower, both on leaving office issued farewell addresses that speak to the requirement not to get involved. And in fact, for the vast majority of our short history, America was designed deliberately not to get involved in external affairs, although the British kept coming over. We kicked them out and then they came back over in 1812. As we were a rising power, we decided for the first time in world history that rising power and an established power would collaborate together. Maybe that's a future for America and China, we'll see. But there's a tension in American foreign policy between the realist impulse and the idealist impulse. The realist one to see it as it is and take action to make it how we want it to be, and the idealist one to create a better world for everyone else, to share the great benefits of what America is for the rest of the world. This is a constant struggle in how we see ourselves and our position in the world. There are costs, however, in trying to pursue everyone else. And I think President Obama gets a lot of criticism inside the United States from particular sources for being indecisive or weak or what have you. But if thinking through your decision without making an instant decision and thinking about your target set and applying a small footprint approach, a very discrete approach is weakness, then I think that contrasts quite well to the shoot 'em up, go crazy, invade everywhere and see how that goes approach. We've tried that. Didn't go too well. But there's a serious sort of point here about how you have a long-term sustainable program against the kinds of enemies that we find, or groups that we find around the world. And I'm convinced that the small footprint approach is the best way, although, as I've noted, and I'll again say it has very significant problems and drawbacks, but they're less significant than the alternative go all out approach.
Niels Komveld, Red Sox. I wondered if you focus purely on military counter-terrorism issues without trying to win the hearts and minds of the population, don't you risk that you actually create more terrorists than you eliminate?
Yeah, this is a significant line of debate, and it's not an insignificant one. I would contend that invading and the appearance of occupying territories creates many more enemies than a counterterrorism approach. The counterterrorism approach says, if you stand up against us or our allies or our partners, then you will die. And you will continue to die until you decide that maybe you're going to speak to seek change rather than use a gun to seek change. Occupying a territory, and yes, inevitably, if you kill people, their families will be upset and all the rest of it. But hopefully, over a period of time, the message gets through that we will not tolerate violence as a means to change. But what we have to be open to is dialogue. And there's a whole sort of secondary piece of this, which I didn't get into at all, which is the ideological discussion, which we're terrible at, but we need to do. And my advice to my high command was always that we should not seek to present America to the world in a particular way, but what we should do is seek to list very clearly, based on very good intelligence, what the enemy has been doing in order for both, particularly for the people in the middle who get caught in these terrible situations, to understand really the kind of threat that is amongst them. And, you know, the recent beheadings, I think, sends a very clear message to the people in the middle. You may hate America, but here's your alternative, potentially. So we're okay with, you can hate us as much as you want, just say so. If you take up the time, until I answer it to your satisfaction. Or do you want another answer?
Mine is a kind of comment and question after that. My name is Adam. I think the big powers like United States have some responsibilities as they lead some international organizations like UN and NATO. So these superpowers, let me say, should be consistent with their strategies. They have to act in similar ways in certain conditions. So this is the expectation from this kind of powers by others. I mean, mainly the allies in different regions. So this expectation and consistency, the stability of strategy is very important to shape the environment in some areas, as in Middle East now. So do you think that this change of strategies is will be harming the United States and maybe more than that, these organizations like NATO and UN, this change of strategy will harm these organizations as well as the United States, and so how will it have a long-term impact on the United States and these organizations? Let me explain a little bit. For example,
Very briefly.
okay. In Middle East, when you left a vacuum, power vacuum, it is filled by other powers. So you have allies like Saudi Arabia, for example. So their expectations can be more than what you have done. So do you think this is a danger for the United States and the other organizations led by the United States?
I think I can answer it. Well, at least try. I understand and acknowledge that it's very difficult sometimes for outsiders to see continuity of America's position over time. Like any other democratic state, the internal debates and the internal constituencies that are trying to influence policy do have an effect. There are debates that take place and changes do take place. What I've been talking about so much is not necessarily a strategy in the overarching national sense, but a military strategic operational approach to the strategic challenge. So the US foreign policy, for example, the president has also been criticized for having no coherent policy towards the Middle East right now. Well, if anybody can come up with one, I'd love to know. Because if you look at each individual case, there are some similarities, but there are very great differences between the various territories, some not even states anymore, but the various territories that are experiencing very rapid change. It certainly defies my imagination to come up with a coherent policy towards that. So we have what I describe as a hub and spoke approach. And so it requires a significant amount of policy making agility to keep track with how can you treat various groups in ways that are effective, despite the fact that there are some policy differences in approach from country or territory to territory. This is complicated stuff, but the approach that one might take in Syria is different to the approach that one might take in Iraq, which is different to the approach one might take perhaps in Libya or Egypt, for example. These are not, they're not the same problem now. A whole lots of different problems, or different challenges, I should say. And my bottom line in all of this is it's really up to the local people to pursue their destiny, to put it in colourful language, I suppose. And there may, my personal take on this is there's going to be a time, a very ugly series of decades where this plays out. This is not a short-term game. It's going to get very ugly for a long period of time. And so in a sense, it's a containment of the kinds of social pressures for change that have been unleashed in these places.
One over there. I see a few more questions. I'll keep your questions as brief as possible.
Thank you. Frank Francis from the Belgian Review Committee for the Intelligence Services. I would like to turn to the intelligence implications of the strategy. It's a simplification, but I think that the intelligence needs for a coin operation are not the same as for a counterterrorism CT operation. To simplify things, if you have a coin operation, which is a localized thing, then you need intelligence on a local situation and on the people who are on the territory. If you have a CT operation worldwide, then in fact you have to have other intelligence. For instance, I myself, you, we are not suspected to be Afghan insurgents because we are not Afghan and we are not in Afghanistan. But we could be terrorists, we could have sympathy for the Afghan cause. So that makes a lot of difference. So my question is, with the shift in military strategy, did we also have a shift in intelligence strategy? And I think that we have all seen in the last year with the NSA and the prison thing that we are all suspects, not only the persons who are on Afghan territory.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it really goes to the heart of the challenge. I think you need essentially two things. You need to understand the context in which various groups exist and operate, and that is a global challenge. That's where you need sort of white intel. You look at the General Flynn discussion of red, blue, and white intel. Even if you're just doing the CT operation, you need the white intel. You have to understand the effect that the operation will have in the locality you're talking about. But I think your broader point is understanding the threat, right? The nation of threats that exist perhaps in cyberspace or in that interconnected, non-territorially linked sense. And that's why we're investing a tremendous amount of focus and effort on social media exploitation and analysis in order to get some kind of guiding indications in that area. General Clapper himself has said it's one of his top priorities. And it is developing some pretty interesting insights and capabilities.
Two more questions. First, Michael Herman, and then Albert.
I'm Michael Herman, Oxford. I was very, very impressed by your figures really on security and the security costs of all this in terms of a system really that we saw start during the Second War with the relatively small code word system for election park, and then spreading to code words inside code words, spreading to imagery and so on and so forth. A great proliferating system, imposing great difficulty for all sorts of people, especially what's your answer on this? Even with a small footprint sort of operation system, what's the public interest in intelligence secrets continuous? The press will continue to organise leaks. What's the answer short of increasing the penalties and taking a few people like me and having them shot or sent to Siberia?
Okay, thank you. All right. Again, let me stress that I do not answer for the United States government. I agree with you. One of the things that happened in the very sort of basic sense, we had allied forces, Five Eyes or non-Five, and it happened with even Five Eyes forces in various places we've been involved. We're facing a bottom-up intelligence challenge. And I've got a whole different paper on bottom-up versus top-down. There's a fascinating piece about that too. But we'll have an allied force that goes out, collects information, writes up a report, it goes up to an American headquarters, a secret, no foreign, and comes back down and can't be given to the force that generated the intel. That's at the sort of most basic level, and then the challenges escalate from there. Both General Flynn and Admiral McCraven in particular, at least with respect to special operations forces, have tried very, very hard to open collaboration with both our Five Eyes partners and also beyond Five Eyes. Admiral McCraven wanted to bring everybody in. If you're part of the team, you're part of the team, and that's it. And the cloud does offer technical opportunities there where you can have a chip card, your access will be determined according to your need. So technically we can solve that problem, I think. But probably the hardest nut to crack beyond the American military personnel system is the American military security system in terms of determining what's classified and what's not, who has access to it. So I admire them for trying. And as we've seen that General Flynn has recently retired. So the new direction that the intelligence community takes on that, we'll have to wait and see. But there are forces inside the American system that, because of the great service that our allies and partners have worked with us and the partnerships that we have, we are working very hard to try and broaden that net, but it is very hard from the inside. Please let me assure you. I've seen people work on this and stuff.
Okay. Final question. Yeah.
Bulgaria. I would like to ask you, how would you solve the eventual tension in your intelligence community if you leave the Afghan community on its own and they decide to increase the drug production? Because you have also law enforcement intelligence. And that would not be easy with the civilian or the military intelligence.
Yeah, again, I don't answer for my government. America could stop the drug war if it stopped demand.
That's the answer, right? Okay. Every time you have a US speaker at a European conference, everybody has a tendency to fire all the questions that they would have liked to ask the American government themselves already for years. I think you answered this fire in a very friendly way. Thank you very much.